Hello Berkshire students, staff, and families. This is Mr. Clinkscale here. And today here at Berkshire, we're taking a moment to pause and reflect as we honor and celebrate the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. As we know, Dr. King was not only a famous American, but he was an inspirational American who still inspires us positively today. Today we're about to hear segments of a very famous speech that Dr. King gave called "I've Been to the Mountaintop." And this speech was given the day before he was assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. It's particularly impactful because it shows his absolute bravery in the face of threats on his life and how he continued to persevere and had a total commitment to peaceful protest. This also reflects on Dr. King's legacy because it shows his accomplishments, that even during the heights of the civil rights movement that he helped to inspire and helped to lead people, it shows that this speech is still relevant today, some 53 years later. So stay tuned and listen to this speech that's being read by our students.
Something is happening in Memphis. Something is happening in our world. And you know, if I were standing at the beginning of time with the possibility of taking a kind of general and panoramic view of the whole of human history up to now, and the Almighty said to me, "Martin Luther King, which age would you like to live in?" Strangely enough, I would turn to the Almighty and say, "If you allow me to live just a few years into the second half of the 20th century, I will be happy."
Now that's a strange statement to make, because the world is all messed up. The nation is sick, the trouble is in the land, confusion all around. That's a strange statement, but I know somehow that only when it's dark enough can you see the stars, and I see God working in this period of the 20th century in a way that men, in some strange way, are responding.
Something is happening in our world. The masses of people are rising up, and wherever they are assembled today, whether they are in Johannesburg, South Africa, Nairobi, Kenya, Accra, Ghana, New York City, Atlanta, Georgia, Jackson, Mississippi, or Memphis, Tennessee, the cry is always the same. We want to be free.
Another reason that I am happy to live in this period is we have been forced to a point where we are going to have to grapple with problems that men have been trying to grapple with for years, but demands didn't force them to do it. Survival demands that we grapple with them. Men for years now have been talking about war and peace, but now no longer can they just talk about it. It is no longer a choice between violence and nonviolence. It's nonviolence or non-existence. That is why we are here today.
And also in the human rights revolution, if something isn't done, and done in a hurry, to bring the colored peoples out of their world and their long years of poverty, the long years of hurt and neglect, the whole world is doomed. Now I'm just happy that God has allowed me to live in this period and to see what is unfolding.
We aren't engaged in any negative protests or any negative arguments with anybody. We are saying that we are determined to be men. We are determined to be people. We are saying that we are God's children, and that we are God's children. We do not have to live our life like we are forced to live.
Now, what does all this mean in this great period of history? It means that we've got to stay together. We've got to stay together and maintain unity. You know, whenever Pharaoh wanted to prolong the period of slavery in Egypt, he had a favorite formula for doing it. What was that? He kept the slaves fighting among themselves. But whenever the slaves get together, something happens in Pharaoh's court, and he cannot hold the slaves in slavery. When the slaves get together, that's the beginning of getting out of slavery. Now let us maintain unity.
We aren't going to let any mace stop us. We are masters in our nonviolent movement and disarming police forces. They don't know what to do. I've seen them so often. I remember in Birmingham, Alabama, we were in that majestic struggle there. We would move out of the 16th Street Baptist Church day after day. By hundreds we would move out. And Bull Connor would tell them to send the dogs forth. And they did come. But we just went before the dog singing, "Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around."
Now the other thing we will have to do is this. Always anchor our external direct action with the power of economic withdrawal. Now we are poor people. Individually, we are poor when you compare us with white society in America. We are poor. Never stop and forget that collectively, that means all of us together. Collectively, we are richer than all the nations in the world, with the exception of 9. Did you ever think about that?
After you leave the United States, Soviet Russia, Great Britain, West Germany, France, and I could name the others, the American Negro collectively is richer than most nations of the world. We have an annual income of more than $30 billion a year, which is more than all of the exports of the United States, and more than the national budget of Canada. Do you know that? That's power right there if we know how to pull it.
We don't have to argue with anybody. We don't have to curse and go around acting bad with our words. We don't need any bricks and bottles. We don't need any Molotov cocktails. We just need to go around to these stores and to these massive industries in our country and say, God sent us by here to say to you that you're not treating his children right. And we've come by here to ask you to make the first item on your agenda fair treatment where God's children are concerned. Now, if you are not prepared to do that, we do have an agenda that we must follow, and our agenda calls for withdrawing economic support from you.
Let us rise up tonight with a greater readiness. Let us stand with a greater determination, and let us move on in these powerful days, these days of challenge to make America what it ought to be. We have an opportunity to make America a better nation, and I want to thank God once more for allowing me to be here with you.
You know, several years ago, I was in New York City autographing the first book I had written. And while sitting there autographing books, a demented black woman came up. The only question I heard from her was, "Are you Martin Luther King?" And I was looking down writing, and I said yes. And the next minute, I felt something beating on my chest. Before I knew it, I had been stabbed by this demented woman. I was rushed to the Harlem hospital. It was a dark Saturday afternoon, and that blade had gone through. And the x-rays revealed that the tip of the blade was on the edge of my aorta, the main artery. And once that's punctured, you're drowned in your own blood, and that's the end of you.
It came out in the New York Times the next morning that if I merely sneezed, I would have died. Well, about 4 days later, they allowed me, after the operation, after my chest had been opened and the blade had been taken out, to move around in the wheelchair in the hospital. They allowed me to read some of the mail that came in, and from all over the states and the world, kind letters came in. I read a few, but one of them I will never forget. I had received one from the president and the vice president. I've forgotten what those telegrams said. I'd received a visit and a letter from the governor of New York, but I've forgotten what the letter said. But there was another letter that came from a little girl, a young girl who was a student at the White Plains High School, and I looked at that letter, and I'll never forget it. It said simply, "Dear Dr. King, I am a 9th grade student at the White Plains High School," and she said, "While it should not matter, I would like to mention that I am a white girl. I read in the paper of your misfortune and of your suffering, and I read that if you had sneezed, you would have died. And I'm simply writing to you to say that I'm so glad you did not sneeze."
And I want to say tonight that I too am happy that I didn't sneeze. Because if I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been around here in 1960, when students all over the South started sitting in at lunch counters. And I knew that as they were sitting in, they were really standing up for the best American dream and taking the whole nation back to those great wells of democracy, which were dug deep by the founding fathers and the Declaration of Independence in the Constitution. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been around here in 1961, when we decided to take a ride for freedom and end segregation and interstate travel.
If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been here in 1963 when the black people of Birmingham, Alabama aroused the conscience of this nation and brought into being the Civil Rights Bill. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have had a chance later that year in August to try and tell America about a dream that I had had. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been down in Selma, Alabama to see the great movement there. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been in Memphis to see a community rally around those brothers and sisters who are suffering. I'm so happy that I didn't sneeze.
And then I got into Memphis, and some began to say the threats or talk about the threats that were out. What would happen to me from some of our sick white brothers? Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead, but it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop and I don't mind.
Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will, and He's allowed me to go up the mountain, and I've looked over. And I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we, as a people, will get to the promised land.
And so I am happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
So as we conclude, I'd just like to thank again our staff and students who read some of the excerpts from that very famous speech, that I've Been to the Mountaintop speech by Dr. King. As you can see, as we are now 53 years past when this speech was first given, it still is important today. And as we reflect on some of the civil and racial unrest that we've seen in this country, most recently over the summer with the deaths of people such as George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and so many others that we need to recognize as well, we need to understand that peaceful protest is so important in our American democracy, and we can still be inspired by the life and legacy of Dr. King. And as we reflect back on the events in our nation's capital in Washington, D.C. that occurred on Wednesday, January 6th, we see that peaceful protests must always be adhered to. And in our American democracy, it is never acceptable for violence. And that's what we're trying to really take from the life of Dr. King. Because like Dr. King, he was also inspired by great people such as Mahatma Gandhi. So in conclusion, I just want to again thank our students and staff. I hope that you continue to take a time to really reflect on Dr. King's legacy and what he means to us today. Thank you very much.